Welcome to a special edition of Legal AF. I'm joined by constitutional scholar Peter Shane, who is a professor in residence, a scholar in residence at NYU Law School, and I could spend half the show giving you his body of work. But we're going to focus particularly, take it from me. He's expert in this field of constitutional law, presidential power, the separation of powers, and all the things that matter for him to be a sharp critic of the Roberts Court and to explain and brief our audience. He's on it. He's got an amazing new article out in The Atlantic, which I commend everybody to go read, which has the very pithy but right on point title of "This is the Presidency John Roberts Has Built." And we're going to talk at length about the unitary executive model, whatever that is, but that has been used as a cudgel or as a weapon by John Roberts, along with the other right wing of the Supreme Court, to reshape the American presidency. Or as you referred to it, Peter, a constitutional realignment has occurred. Let me just to get our audience into this, let me just give a teaser, like, they're going on their Kindle and they get the first page of the article. So here's what Peter just wrote in The Atlantic. No one on the Supreme Court has gone further to enable Donald Trump's extreme exercise of presidential power than the Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts. So this is not happenstance. Under Supreme Court practice, the most senior justice in the majority, which is always the Chief Justice when he votes or so votes, determines who will write the main opinion. What America is witnessing is a remaking of the American presidency into something closer to a dictatorship. Insert chill down your spine there for everybody. Peter continues, Trump is enacting this change and taking advantage of its possibilities, but he is not the inventor of its claim to constitutional legitimacy. That project is the work of John Roberts. Professor Shane, welcome to Legal AF.
Great to be with you, Michael. Thanks for having me.
So you and I talked and kibitzed a little bit before we got on the air about this unitary executive branch or unitary executive model and how it's been used by John Roberts. And it seems facile at first blush, right? The executive branch has one occupant, it's the president, he gets all the power. But that's not how it has worked until they got the numbers on the United States Supreme Court to kind of force this theory down our throat. If you look back 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 200 years ago, why don't you walk our audience through what is the premise of your article and explain in layman terms what is this theory that's being used and what has it replaced?
Sure. And the theory and why it's important may actually be clearer if we start with what was conventional thinking about the presidency, let's say before 1980, in broad strokes. The executive branch has a head. The head is the president. The presidency is chartered by Article 2 of the Constitution. It says the executive power is vested in the president. Fine. The question we're dealing with is really what is the relationship of this president to the executive branch of government, what we call the bureaucracy. And again, before the advent of unitary executive theory, the conventional wisdom would have been that particularly in domestic affairs, presidents have important roles to play. Some roles are spelled out in the Constitution. The president negotiates treaties. The president is commander-in-chief. But when it comes to domestic affairs, almost everything the executive branch does, it does pursuant to authority that has been given to the executive branch by Congress. The president doesn't do this stuff by himself or herself. It's done by agencies, boards, commissions, these organizations that get set up by Congress. And in carrying out their tasks, the agencies, worry about, complying with the general direction that they've been given. They sort of have to remain within whatever channel of authority Congress is given. They're subject to ongoing congressional oversight. And the president is the supervisor of this. He has to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And so, that alone gives the president a lot of influence, particularly when you add to it the fact that the head of any agency, what constitutionally we talk about as the principal officer, the head of any agency has to be appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. Clearly, the presidents are going to choose only people who are more or less aligned with their own value structure. So that's going to be very influential. But once the secretary of X department is there, or the commissioners on so-and-so commission are there, what they're doing, again, is channeled by law. And the president, the nature of the relationship that the president has to these people is itself subject to law. So that, for example, Congress doesn't just say to the Federal Communications Commission or let's say the Environmental Protection Agency, doesn't say to the Environmental Protection Agency, go out and do whatever you like when it comes to regulating pollution, and we'll see you later. There's a thing called the Administrative Procedure Act that sets forth, again, a very specific process for how rules get made, and those rules get reviewed in court. Now, the president can, he can express his preferences for how those rules should go. Again, he's appointed the administrator of the EPA, but how far into the process the president can wade is largely determined by the statutes that Congress has written that govern administrative process. And very importantly, when it comes to a lot of these agencies that operate in domestic affairs, you're talking about the National Labor Relations Board or the Federal Trade Commission, for example, Congress also gets to decide whether the people who are appointed serve at the president's pleasure or whether they can be discharged only for good cause. Good cause is typically, in a typical statute, would be called inefficiency, neglect, or malfeasance. Now, that's sort of the conventional checks and balances view. Presidents have a lot of influence, and I want to say that presidents have used their influence in part because Congress has given them broader and broader authority to the executive branch, really since the New Deal. So that there's been an upward trajectory in executive power, but still within the kind of general story I told, which is they rely on Congress to give an agency power to do whatever it does. The agency has to fulfill its mission consistent with whatever procedures Congress has set up. And whether the people, obviously the president can always weigh in, but whether they can be fired by the president is determined by Congress.
Which are examples of a proper functioning checks and balance system between these two co-equal branches of government, right?
Right. And of course, and the whole thing is also subject to supervision by the courts. I mean, right. Congress may write a broad statutory authority for the executive branch to carry out, but it's still up to a court, if somebody challenges it, to determine whether the facts actually support the regulation, whether the regulation has been explained in a way that kind of rationally connects what the agency has done to the mission that Congress assigned, and so forth. That is the conventional checks and balances system, and it's operated.
Yeah. So that's where we were.
Right. That's where we were.
That's where we were. And now Roberts, over time, leads the court and eventually gets enough like-minded jurists to join him, like Kavanaugh and Gorsuch and others, about the unitary executive branch model, which is on full display now, right? And so we always worried about Humphrey's executor and what would happen with that. And then you got the Celia Law case from 2020 that was like, that doesn't look good. And that, as you pointed out, of course, in your article, was written by John Roberts. Why don't you talk about when John Roberts became such an acolyte of this unitary model, and then how has it evolved, in your view, over the last 10, 5, 1 years?
Yes, a great question, Michael. So really, the theory went from kind of a marginal idea of how to read Article 2 of the Constitution to a kind of mainstream position for legal conservatives with the Reagan administration, right? Roberts was in the Reagan White House. Sam Alito was at the Justice Department. The Federalist Society is being founded at this time. And They take the view that the vesting of executive power in a president and the responsibility to take care that the laws be faithfully executed means a few things. Thing number one is the president can fire at will. Again, now I'm taking their theory. I'm quoting their theory. I'm not stating what I think the law is. The president can fire at will any policymaker in the executive branch, no matter what Congress has said in the statutes. Insofar as anything is going on that requires an exercise of, what as lawyers we call discretionary judgment, where there's some room for an administrator to decide to proceed in one way or another. The president gets to control that exercise of discretion. A perfect example from the George H.W. Bush administration is that the Justice Department told the president that it was unconstitutional for Congress to authorize the Centers for Disease Control to put out a pamphlet on AIDS that the White House couldn't edit, even though what the Reagan White House would bring to bear in terms of expertise about AIDS is dubious. So in any event, but that's what we're talking about. Controlling all of that exercise of judgment for a long time, and the argument persisted throughout the 80s and the 90s, and it typically focused just on the hiring and firing question. But the mainstream position was what I said before, which is it's up to Congress. And in the late 80s, the Supreme Court decided a case called Morrison versus Olson that upheld the independent counsel provisions of the Ethics in Government Act that Congress passed after Watergate. And this is an opinion written by Chief Justice Rehnquist. I mean, I think he was still actually Associate Justice at the time. But Rehnquist wasn't exactly a flaming liberal or a lightweight when it came to executive power. He had headed the Office of Legal Counsel under Nixon before he was on the Supreme Court. So he was a Justice Department defender of executive power. You
worked in that department as well, right?
Yes, not at the same time.
Right.
But yes, my government experience was largely in the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel under Carter in the beginning of Reagan. So but even that opinion, Morrison versus Olson, stood up for Congress's power to set the terms. The sole dissenter was Antonin Scalia. And Scalia planted the seed for something that into which unitary executive power has kind of metastasized. He has said that the vesting of executive power in the president meant vesting all of the executive power. It's an interesting reading. The word all doesn't appear there. And from that, Roberts and other folks, very prominently Bill Barr has been a sort of theorist on this, began to state as a matter of principle and theory that constitutionally speaking, and I'm just going to try to say this with a straight face because this is now in multiple Supreme Court opinions. They say that constitutionally speaking, the executive branch is a one-person branch of government, that all of the constitutional authority vested in the executive is vested in the president. And so...
then why does he have an administration? I'm just asking.
You're going to challenge me when I wanted to keep a straight face here.
Yeah.
So, well, let me just say, part of what follows from that, particularly in the mind of Donald Trump, if constitutionally the executive branch is a one-person branch of government, and let's say you, Michael, are head of EPA and I'm the president, then even though Congress has given you an assignment, constitutionally, it's my assignment. And the fact that you go ahead and regulate is entirely subject to my willingness to let you go ahead and regulate. And so you start having the court and the president talk about these agencies as though they're acting on behalf of the president, not on behalf of Congress or on behalf of the law. And this makes an enormous psychological difference in the executive branch. I mean, you could think of, think of parents with a teenager. If the teenager, the parents could always decide to give the teenager a lot of free rein to make a lot of decisions for him or herself, but the teenager knows that it's going to be up to the parents. And so there's always a sort of thinking about, is what I'm doing going to be acceptable to, let's call them, the checks and balances parents.
Mm-hmm.
If the teenager thinks, no, I don't need their permission, then you're going to have a much more adventurous use of that discretion.
Mm-hmm.
And that is exactly what the Trump administration is doing. So what starts in 2010, so key decisions are things, not necessarily, kitchen table conversation in every household in America, but there's a case called Free Enterprise Fund against the Public Company Oversight Accounting Board. There's a case called, you mentioned, CELA Law versus the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. And most recently, Trump versus the United States, the presidential immunity opinion. And these are cases that all, number one, just as a matter of, their precise holding, as we say, pretty much give the president all but complete control over the hiring and firing of principal officers. You mentioned the Humphreys executive case from 1935, which is the case that upheld Congress in its ability to put conditions on removal. The only question now is whether the court's going to get rid of that entirely. Where the court has taken us so far is that the president, in the view of the Roberts Court, is entitled to fire at will the head of any agency if that agency has a single director. Mm-hmm. So there's the one EPA administrator, the one director of the Consumer Finance
as
Protection.
Opposed to a board control.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. They haven't formally decided yet if that's the law for these multi-member commissions and boards. Mm-hmm. But the second thing, and this is the most alarming opinion to me in a way, is the Trump immunity opinion. Not so much just because of its holding. One hopes that we're not going to have a day in, day out anxiety about, how far you can go in prosecuting former presidents. I suppose that could come up again, but, that's not a day in, day out worry about the Republic. But in describing the powers of the president, the court said the president was entitled to former president would be entitled to some immunity, qualified or absolute, for any official acts. And absolute immunity would kick in for a certain category of official acts that the court called conclusive and exclusive, mm-hmm. or preclusive. Mm-hmm. So among those powers, and these are powers that, according to the court, Congress can't regulate, courts can't police, are the powers of supervision with regard to everybody working on the president's behalf throughout the executive branch. This is a very scary picture. Mm-hmm. And I like to say the only three things that bother me about it: it ignores the constitutional text, it ignores constitutional history, and it's completely oblivious to the danger of authoritarianism that just is present when you say this one person has the power to fire at will anybody doing any policy relevant work throughout the executive branch, which is close to where we are.
Here's how you put it in your Atlantic article that we're talking about. This is you. I'm quoting you to you. It's always good. It's hard to overstate how much is wrong in Roberts' narrative of the presidency. It muddles constitutional text. It flouts constitutional history. It is willfully ignorant of the risks of authoritarianism in a polarized populist age. Its very premise that the Constitution creates a one-person branch of government is provably untrue by just reading the Constitution, which again refers to executive departments. The president's constitutional role does not require at-will removal power, except in the case of those few officials who directly assist the president in fulfilling specific Article 2 roles. I mean, you couldn't put it any better than I couldn't put it any better than that.
I still find it persuasive. I will say that again, this was not anticipated. This was not unanticipated by people thinking about executive power in the past. So in the 1830s, Joseph Story, who is of course one of the first great justices of the Supreme Court, in those days you could apparently have enough time, even if you were a Supreme Court justice, to also be on the Harvard Law faculty. And while he was doing that, he was able to write a treatise, which was really the kind of preeminent treatise about the Constitution before the Civil War. And Congress decided early on that whatever Article 2 meant, the president was not required to get the Senate's approval to fire somebody. That was actually an early fight. Could the president do this by himself, or did he need the Senate? And Story said, Alexander Hamilton, when he wrote The Federalist, said the Senate would be involved. I think he was right, but practices evolve differently. But he said it's very important that this idea not be extended to the thought that the president can fire anybody at will, because in the hands of a person of, I'm going to mess up his exact
phrase, I know where you're going,
a base person of high ambition and base principles. This will turn, every government official into a mere creature of the president, just concerned about basically fulfilling the president's wishes rather than taking care of faithfully executing the law. I mean, he saw this in 1833.
Yeah. He saw the coming of Donald Trump, the possibility that a populist would ride in, and then emboldened by an immunity decision, that's where the monster got loose, right? On his return.
Well, it is. I suppose that is true, and it is where it is the opinion, I think, that best captures what has become the psychology of the Trump administration. Donald Trump being Donald Trump, you could argue he didn't really need a legal theory to think that he was, the be all and end all, that he would be the chief executive, not just of the executive branch, but of the Kennedy Center, Harvard University, CBS, every institution that has the capacity for independent thought in the country. He might have had that aspiration anyway, but it is being able to point to these lines in Supreme Court opinions, most often written by Roberts, that say he's the one-man branch of government. He has this power beyond regulation to control how people working on his behalf exercise their discretionary judgment. That really is what's shaping his psychology.
Yeah. And Roberts is taking an opportunist with this president breaking this many eggs to make his omelet, has decided to use this guy to create a body of law and precedent that will live beyond him to memorialize the unitary president model, right? Enshrine it once and for all in Supreme Court precedent. And the sad part of this discussion is that if a normal, not base person, as Story anticipated, had been elected president, we wouldn't be talking about some of these we would, some of them have already happened, but we wouldn't be talking about the immunity decision. We wouldn't be talking about the firing of Gwen Wilcox and the others and Kathy Harris and the body of law that has accumulated under, as a law professor, there's going to be entire treatises, hornbooks that are just devoted to Trump law, just law with his name in it. Precedent with his name in it. And it's all because we have this guy and Roberts as an opportunist wanting to take advantage of it to put in the books for a long period of time as precedent, this doctrine.
Well, one of the things, so first of all, let me just elicit a little sympathy here. I co-author a case book, I would say, I like to say the case book on separation of powers law. Mm-hmm. I am now working on its new edition. And
right.
this is not easy because, every week there's a new issue that sort of has to be thought about.
How do you teach law today? I mean, like when you and I were in law school, I graduated from Duke in '91, and you graduated from Yale.
Yeah.
Yeah, and some other
Oh,
time,
yeah.
some other time. But when we were there, everything was static enough that whatever body of law you were taught in con law or other classes for the 3 years you were there, sure, things may have changed after you got one or two cases might have got overturned, but you sort of had a full. How do you teach law today in real time about issues that are being reshaped, as you said, restructured, recalibrated by this United States Supreme Court? I feel sorry for law professors. I feel sorry for law students.
I will say so. I was teaching full time at Ohio State for a long time, and then moved to New York, and NYU was nice enough to give me this residency. And uh, I told them I'm good for teaching one course a year. That's about as much grading as I still have in me. And they've been kind enough to ask me to teach constitutional law a few times. I'm doing the legislation and administrative law course this coming year. But whenever I teach constitutional law, and this goes back a ways, there's a point in the semester when an agitated student will say, sometimes politely, sometimes with a certain degree of upset affect, how could this be law? Why are we treating this as law? Are the judges just making this up? You saw this when Dobbs was overturned. When Dobbs overturned Roe versus Wade.
Yeah.
And now, with what's going on with regard to the presidency. And what you say about the stability of the law, yeah, you're right. I mean, things did change, incrementally. There were some big cases, to be sure. But the case that, again, let's just talk about Humphrey's Executor. Humphrey's Executor was decided in 1935. This was the one that upheld the constitutionality of the FTC. A unanimous opinion. It is a unanimous opinion by a court that is as ideologically diverse as any imaginable. I mean, you have, the so-called four horsemen of the apocalypse, the most anti-New Deal, pro-laissez-faire justices. You have, the beginnings of the most, pro-New Deal folks. You have the early 20th century liberals, Cardozo and Brandeis. And so this is, a diverse coalition. And I want to say a very smart people. Cardozo's in the room, Brandeis is in the room. Justice Stone, I think, is the one who wrote the opinion. I'm sorry, Justice Sutherland wrote the opinion. I think he was, and he had been a law professor at Columbia. I mean, this
it's like the powerhouse of
powerhouse
this is dream team, Supreme Court justices.
Yeah, I sometimes joke that not too diverse unless you count. Some have beards and some don't. That's
different shades of white.
Right, exactly. And their hair is, like ours, different shades. But having said that, now the court is contemplating whether to overturn that opinion. And for sure, the vote will not, if they do so, they won't have more than a 6-3 vote. They might have only a 5-4. But it flies in the face of the usual principle that, we heard about in law school. This is as far as my Latin goes, but stare decisis, let the decision stand.
Right.
Where the court is supposed to pay respect.
Super precedent, 100 years old,
Yeah. And with regard to this particular decision, Congress has relied on this decision in designing, dozens of agencies.
Yeah.
Now, what we saw, you mentioned the firing of Gwen Wilcox from the NLRB and Kathy Harris from the Merit Systems Protection Board. And the Supreme Court, and we don't have to get into all the procedural details, but basically rendered a decision that said, these people ought to stay fired while their case is making its way back up to the Supreme Court. And they did something weird. I mean, judicially weird. They said it's been argued to us that if their dismissals are upheld, this will threaten the independence of
the Federal Reserve Chair.
Right. And they said that's that doesn't follow at all, because the Fed is, a unique institution that harkens back to a tradition beginning with the first and second national banks of the United States. A few things to notice about that.
Completely gratuitous protection for Jay Powell.
That's right. It's like, and what's your recipe for lasagna? This is not,
Right.
this is not part of the case right now. Second, this idea that there's a resemblance between the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve in 2025
The first bank.
and the first and second banks of the United States, that's just nonsense.
Right.
It's just
the Treasury may be a comparator.
Well, but some kind of bank.
A bank. Yeah, that's true.
Up there is the word bank.
Right.
Not bank regulator.
Right.
This is completely different. So this assurance, and as it happens, about a week or two before this decision was rendered, I had an opportunity to talk with a friend of mine who is takes a more unitary executive view of the Constitution. And, I think he's wrong, but we have a nice relationship. And I said, well, what do you think about the Fed? And he said, if Humphrey's executor is not overruled, it'll be because of the Fed, because for the court to be taken seriously as an originalist court, a court that looks back at the way the Constitution was written, for them to just invent a carve out for the Fed would be a really bad look. And
he said that before the decision?
Before the decision. And, I didn't call him up afterwards and say,
I would
have. Say, how's it looking now? But the idea that they're even thinking about that just shows how far they've come from anything like an honest use of history.
Yeah, this is just this is just engineering, judicial activism. They wanted to put a ring fence around the Fed and Jay Powell during this presidency, and they did, which is great, because it's the thing we kept talking about when every time Donald Trump said, I'm going to fire Jay Powell, we said here on Legal AF, that's never happening. The Wall Street knows it. You know it. The Supreme Court knows it. You're not firing him. And then you saw after his walkabout with his hard hat at where he tried to embarrass Jay Powell and got embarrassed in turn, he said, "Yeah, I'm going to keep him." He says, "They don't May 2026. That's okay. We'll keep him until then." The rates are going to get voted on Wednesday, and he's going to lose. They're not going to cut the rates, and he's not going to fire Jay Powell, and everybody's going to sleep better at night.
Well, I think that is probably true. I also think, again, the court in this unsigned opinion, spreads these tea leaves that kind of indicate whatever we do about, Gwynne Wilcox and Kathy Harris, we're probably not going to go along with firing the Fed chair at will. Yeah. So what happens? You start having, right-wing media, and amplified by J.D. Vance, starting saying, maybe there was fraud committed in the in the rehabbing of the bill. They start laying out
the cause
what they think is plausible for cause grounds to dismiss Powell. So, the administration has said to the Supreme Court, "We're not going to defy you, but what we are going to do is going to read you as narrowly as humanly possible." And then
1,000%. My favorite moment, we'll close on this. My favorite moment is when, because he has I don't know. I don't believe all of this stuff in the internet about Donald Trump being illiterate and not being able to read, but he certainly had trouble with his gotcha moment where he pulled out to end his tour. He said, well, it's really $3.1 billion. It's really, and Jay Powell's like, I've never heard that number before for the remodeling. He goes, well, here, it's right here. And then, it's right here. I don't know who writes this for the Fed. And Jay Powell puts on his glasses with his hard hat still on. And he goes, yeah, this is the building. You added an entire building from 5 years ago in your administration. That's an entire building. Well, it's part of the renovation. No, it's a completed building from 5 years ago. When you he didn't say the rest, which was when you appointed me to, which he forgot, to be the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Remember?
Yeah. Right. Sorry, who was president when Epstein died?
All of it. I mean, you just saw Trump say, I don't know why Biden appointed Jay Powell to be the Fed Reserve chair. Like, hello, who is that guy? Look just like you, appointed Jay Powell. But I'm so glad you came on, Peter. You know, you're a voice that our audience hasn't heard from yet to be briefed, and I'm sure they're really going to appreciate it. And as you continue to write for the Atlantic and other places, and you have something interesting, I'm sure I'd love to have you come back on and address our audience. Can I make a deal with you on that?
Yes, we're living in the age of deals. So
Yeah,
you and I have.
I'm a deal maker. Peter M. Shane, who is a distinguished scholar in residence and adjunct professor at New York University, my alma mater, School of Law, who just wrote everybody's got to go run. We'll put it up on the screen here. Everybody's got to go run and pick up the Atlantic and get this piece to talk about the Trump presidency. And more importantly, this is the presidency that John Roberts has built. That's the title. The author is with me here, Peter Shane. Shout out to the Midas Mighty and the Legal AFers. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.